Good morning. It's Brian of London here in the park in Tel Aviv, in Park Hayakon. Wow, and it's warm and I've been walking. Hello. First off, before I get into the big story of the day, we filed our lawsuit. Our case went into the court system in Australia, where they're probably scratching their heads and wondering why a self-representing plaintiff is acting against the two biggest companies in the world. And there'll be more about that. We'll put out some more information in the next couple of days. But while we were preparing and finalizing the documents to send, I see the tweet from Donald Trump with this surprise announcement that Israel and the UAE is suddenly going to be at peace. Diplomatic relations and all of that. And a very carefully worded statement, the Al-Aqsa Mosque will be open to Muslims and the sites of Jerusalem will be available for anyone to pray in. So not quite Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount mentioned there, but let's just look at this. Firstly, I don't like that it's called I'm going to tell you the downsides first, the bits that make me nervous. As many of you know, I've studied Islam to a reasonable degree. So whenever something is proposed in the way of a peace deal between Muslims and non-Muslims, I look to the template for all Muslim peace deals, which is the Hudna, which is basically what we would call a ceasefire. And that's really the only version of peace that Islam and the Islamic scriptures and the examples from the life of Muhammad give you, which is a Hudna, which is a temporary ceasefire whilst the Muslims are not powerful enough to pursue war for jihad, for conquest. So I look upon all peace deals and, I'm pretty certain that the deal with Egypt and the deal with Jordan, they follow this path of being a Hudna. Every 10 years it must be reviewed, and if conditions are not right to resume war, they'll renew the Hudna. That's the best. I don't mind taking a Hudna as long as one is aware of what one is doing. So I have no doubt that the intentions of the ruler of the UAE and the people are good, and that they're going to follow through with this temporary ceasefire. But I don't see it as the start of a grand rapprochement between Islam and non-Islam. That's not going to happen. But we'll take a Hudna. I'll take a Hudna. And calling it the Abrahamic thing, which Jared Kushner seems to have come up with, that I dislike for long-standing reasons, which is that I believe that calling Judaism, Christianity, and Islam the Abrahamic faith is an act of extraordinary deceit. Now, Christianity and Judaism certainly share common values and common roots. Islam is a branch apart, whereas Christianity is quite clearly descended from Judaism. Islam is separated from Christianity and Judaism in many, many, many very deep and profound ways, in its attitudes, its values, the values it inculcates into its people. So anytime I hear somebody trying to bring those all three together under this Abrahamic faiths term, I get very, very suspicious and nervous. And it seems that really is the kind of thinking that Kushner embodies. And that, I can dismiss people like that. Having said that, I'm told, and I see from Twitter and from people I have followed for quite some time from the UAE on Twitter, that the Islamic attitude toward Jews in Israel is not pushed so negatively in the UAE, and hasn't been for some time. Jordan and Egypt are still very negative about Jews and Israel. I mean, and so are the Palestinian Arabs. I mean, it's there at the heart that Surah 1, which is the prayer that constitutes Surah 1, the order is complicated, but Surah 1 of the Quran it forms part of the daily prayer. It's said 17 times a day. It curses those who have gone astray, which is Jews, and it curses those who've been led astray, which is the Christians. Now, whether Muslims choose to emphasize or de-emphasize that relates to Jews today in Israel or not seems to be a choice that they are able to make. And I would like it if they make the choice not to ab initio hate Jews. UAE might be the place where that happens. And I would love to see a change in attitude between the Islamic world and the Arab world, the Arab Islamic world, and eventually, on to who knows where. Once we get something going with the UAE, I'm pretty certain that others will, in the Arab, the Sunni Arab world, they're probably looking at this and may find it. I still don't believe that everybody's going to be loving Jews and Israelis very quickly. I have absolutely no illusions about that. But I also think now what Trump is doing, and the reason this is happening, as far as I can tell, is because Trump set in motion a way in which America could get energy independence. And energy independence, hold on, I'm going to just take my phone out of its case because I think it's going to get too hot. Energy independence, I think, is what the Gulf Arab states are looking at and thinking, what is their business model going forwards? This oil thing is not going to last forever, and they have to find some other way to support their populations. And Israel is the obvious model because we do something other than make money based on stuff in the ground. I hope that is the case, and I don't think anybody other than Trump could have driven this kind of deal to have occurred. Now, if the choice was between allowing or recognizing that Israel was going to apply sovereignty to our citizens living across a green line that's irrelevant, or this sort of start of something quite large between the Sunni Arab world and Israel, obviously Trump picked the one that's better for him, because it doesn't really make a great deal of internal American difference. Sovereignty in Judea-Samaria does make a big difference here in Israel, but even then we didn't take it off the table. And what's wonderful about this particular move is that for the first time we've got a concession, not by giving something, but by not doing something that we wanted to do for now. And they've just said it's not gone, it's suspended. And I'm broadly optimistic that this is a good move. Obviously, if things were normal, if it wasn't Orange Man bad, the Nobel Peace Prize would be closing nominations and it would go to Orange Man bad, Netanyahu, and the UAE leadership, whoever they put forward to take this. Someone's saying suspended in Israel means off the table completely for sovereignty. I don't believe so. I think that we will find a way to apply our own laws to our own people living in Judea-Samaria. It was never annexation. Annexation was the wrong word. We are never going to annex Judea-Samaria. We never need to annex. It's not an annexation because there's no other sovereign entity that actually has a valid claim to that land. So you don't have to annex it. Annex means take from a sovereign entity to another sovereign entity. There's no sovereign entity in that land. And the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state ain't going to happen, wasn't going to happen. The two-state delusion was always a delusion, was never viable. And what we're going to see now is that once the Sunni Arab states drop this pretense that the Palestinian people and their struggle is so important, because it's obviously not, everything's going to change. The Palestinians have put themselves on their own. They've not done anything to engender warm feelings towards them, and that's to do with Arab psyche and Islamic psyche, because they were forced, after the defeats of the Grand Arab armies in 67 and later, they were forced to cast themselves as victims, perpetual victims, and that's a terribly destructive thing for an Arab and a Muslim psyche to do. And so years of casting themselves as victims and years of the outside Arab world seeing them as victims have pushed them down to nothing. And it was exactly the wrong thing to do. They had many opportunities to take a reasonable deal. They never took it. And waiting to destroy Israel, which was all that their entire existence was predicated on. The only reason to have a Palestinian state, as opposed to, say, calling Jordan a Palestinian state, the only reason was to destroy the rest of Israel. So, as far as I'm concerned, it was never going to happen. This hasn't destroyed it because it wasn't there to begin with. And I'm not about to book a holiday to the UAE. They've got an indoor ski slope like the one in Milton Keynes, which I have skied in. It was underwhelming. They have malls and shopping. I'm not really into that kind of stuff. But I think it is important. And certainly the UAE is obviously, they're looking around the Middle East, and the only people in this neighborhood who can stand up to Iran are Israel and America. The Saudis have bought a lot of weapons, but I wouldn't think that they could stand up to the entire Iranian machine if it chose to go against them. They would need Israel. And we'll see, who's next? Which one of the Gulf Arab states? Now, the ones close to Iran will stay, I think. But when Saudi Arabia? And the final point, actually, I'll just bring up here is that these Arab nations are ruled in a despotic and tyrannical way. Now, the benevolence of the ruler varies somewhat from one to the other, but the people are mind-controlled and thought-controlled, or have been to a certain extent, by Islam and by these rulerships. And that's slipping because the internet, because Western television and all of that stuff. I'm wondering whether now is the time that these Islamic rulers can turn off the anti-Jew, anti-Israel propaganda. Can they do it? And will it have a broad effect on society? I don't know the answer to that. I think that anti-Jewish feeling and propaganda is very deep into the Quran. It's really, really heavily in there, but I know it can be de-emphasized. Will they choose to de-emphasize it? And how will the wave of de-emphasizing Jew hatred spread across the Arab world at a time when we're seeing probably an uptick, or at least a lifting the lid on the repressed Jew hatred that's still there in the West? So, could we see the Islamic and Arab worlds start to hate Jews less and the West start to hate Jews more? I don't know. Could be a weird time. The only thing I do know is that the only way Jews are secure is when we're sitting in Israel. When we have our own sovereign state and we have missile tests in Alaska where Mach 5 or 10 missiles hit other Mach 5 or 10 missiles at incredible, just the sheer brilliance of a missile test where and this isn't like Iron Dome with small, slow, short-range missiles. The Arrow 2 test I'm talking about in Alaska the other night was unbelievable high altitudes, very fast ballistic missiles, supersonic in both. It's like, you give the example of two bullets hitting each other in midair, going sideways at each other. That's nothing close to how amazing this was. This was much, much harder than that. But when we have that, and we have our own country, and we can develop those things, and we can defend ourselves, and we've got our army and our air force, then I'm less bothered. Am I bothered by the Jew hatred on Twitter or Facebook? No, I'm not, because, F you, we've got Israel. But that's why Israel is so important, and that's also why anti-Zionism is Jew hatred, and it always will be. Anyway, that's enough. I've rattled on. I'm Brian of London. If you don't know me, I do these talks from the park in Tel Aviv. I'm also, believe me, I'm Muslim from Saudi Arabia. And no problems with Jewish at all. There's a comment that's coming up on the screen. I hope so, and I really hope. I hope that the direction can be pushed that way. And you know, the incitement, which a lot of the incitement that's happened across the Gulf Arabs is by showing them how we treat the Palestinians, and generally that's a whole load of lies. I mean, it really is a whole load of lies. It cuts both ways. Obviously, the Palestinians are, the Gazans especially right now, are sending waves of incendiary balloons, and we've got fires breaking out. We're going to go and have to whack them, but it takes an enormous amount to rouse us, and the kind of lies that surround our treatment of the Palestinians is what has been used to whip up hatred. If that stops across the Middle East, attitudes could change pretty quickly, and we really could be seeing something different come. So I salute President Donald Trump. I also salute Bibi Netanyahu. I understand he's playing a very delicate game. I'd love to see him extend sovereignty to my friends who live in Judea Samaria. They deserve it. They need it. They need proper Israeli civilian law and proper regulations. And we just need to. We can't have this. The situation at the moment is untenable. There's never going to be annexation. We do need to still extend sovereignty and apply civilian law to the people living out there. And I hope that we can still do that. Anyway, I'm Brian of London. I'm in the park in Tel Aviv. I obviously was from London. That's why my name is Brian of London. And we have filed our giant class action lawsuit. If you search on Twitter for crypto class action and for the name JPB Liberty, which is John Perry Barlow Liberty, you'll find that we are suing Google, Facebook and Twitter. Actually, we're not suing Twitter right now. We've put Twitter on warning, Google and Facebook, because there's some delicate games we have to play, because when you sue in Australia, you are liable for the other side's costs if you lose. And my friend has sued in his own name, and we've raised a small amount of money, but we haven't raised the many. We just certainly don't have $300 billion in the bank, which the other side does. So we have to be a little bit careful how we commence this proceeding. And hopefully much more details about that, and we'll be able to release some of the documents as soon as they've been stamped by the Australian court, which is exciting. Anyway, Shabbat Shalom to you all, and I'll see you the next time. Bye-bye.